native. He spent 20 years in the Navy. Okay, I wanted to make sure I remembered that correctly.
Right, retired as a
he worked
CB with construction battalion. So.
At the Choate Correctional Center in Anna.
Right.
And for 6 years, and he's just always had a strong interest in the Lincoln Developmental Center, or you call it Lincoln State School, or you can go back to the feeble-minded name, and which is what I used in the publicity because I found that the most interesting title. And I will go ahead and turn the program over to Chris.
All right. Well, again, as she said, I'm Chris Glick, right here from Lincoln, Logan County. As far as what the LDC, where I got the information from, and part of the experience-wise was granted when I worked in a mental health hospital and with developmentally disabled. But also, the state of Illinois had put out a journal, and it come from the winter of 2011. And the very first chapter that was in it was on the Lincoln Developmental Center. So by sitting down and going through and reading it, became very interesting. And the other, I spent over 3 hours sitting at our own public library back in the one corner over here because the book you could not take out. It was Lincoln Developmental Center, and it come with your Illinois AHBS, the numbers on it. But it went through the entire history of Lincoln Developmental Center. I mean, from its beginning to, unfortunately, its demise in 2002. Unfortunately. So I've also got some others. From an Illinois asylum for feeble-minded children to the Lincoln Developmental Center. The asylum itself was founded in 1877. In 1975 is when it actually became the Lincoln Developmental Center, which lasted until its closing in 2003. We have a long history as far as the different names and as to the administrative responsibilities fell under. In the beginning of it, Illinois Asylum for Feeble-Minded Children was from 1877 to 1909. Then the Lincoln State School and Colony, 1909 to 1953. Lincoln State School, which a lot of us remember as such, was from 1953 to 75, and then the final name for it was LDC, or Lincoln Developmental Center, from 75 until its closing in 2002. With some of these I'm going to be handing out here will be the photos that I found on some of these were incredible, and how quick some of these things come about. But now, history of administrative responsibilities for this. The Board of State Commissions Public Charities, that was from 1871 to 1909. That was actually prior to LDC, or the old state school, actually coming open in 1877. Board of Administrations, 1909 to 1917. Department of Public Welfare, 1917 to 61. And Department of Mental Health, 61 to 65. And then Developmental Disabilities and Mental Health till 2002. Something that was interesting that I got to reading, originally when the LDC, or the old state school, was opened up, there was actually one section that was strictly utilized for Civil War veterans, and one building that was set up strictly for them, as we now know it today, PTSD. Then they really wasn't sure about it, but that's where they actually have one building that was set up strictly for Civil War veterans who were having the issues and the problems with coping, compensating, and issues like that. So that's where it was actually began here in part of this state. In 1865, an act of legislation was created June 5th of 1855 by the State Medical Society. Their actions established the institution. The meeting itself was actually held right up here in Bloomington, Illinois, by 3 different doctors. That was doctors named by Dr. David Prince, Dr. E.R. Rowe, and Dr. J.V.Z. Blaney. It originally, when the doctors made the institution as to what it was to be established for an institution, and it's a good thing we don't use it now, but idiots. That's how they classified the individuals then as compared to today. They were just basically just idiots, and that's how they was looked at. In September 1865, Dr. Wilbur was elected the first superintendent out here at Lincoln Developmental Center. Work began, and it was established to build the new buildings out here. And I've got 4 of the copies, but beginning in November, and the copies with these on the top 2 photos, which actually shows the buildings themselves as then when it was first established. Construction began in 1975 and took 2 years to complete. Was finished in 1977. At that time, a cost of, I wish our buildings would cost this much today, but a total cost of $170,000 to build our first building out here at Lincoln Developmental Center in 2 years. Today, I don't even want to know what the figures are. We're probably talking several $1 million as far as that goes. The original building itself, completely across the front, was 324 feet wide. Its depth went back 215 feet. At the highest point, which is in the center of the building, you can see where the main steeple was 100 feet high, and the outskirts at the highest was 75 feet high. And it also accommodated 300 of the pupils, because originally Lincoln Developmental Center actually began as a child's center for their development and their education for it. And eventually, as things grew and went on, they more became adults from there. Then shortly after, and David and I can contest, my younger brother, our great-grandmother actually worked in this building. It was the laundry building. 2-story brick building, and was completed in 1884, as well as a cottage hospital was finished and developed in 1886, which, if you think about beginning in 1977 to 86, there's 9 years of not actually having an actual true hospital set up for establishment for any of our the residents and patients. However, before any building was acquired, and why they did it, I don't know. There was a lot of legislation and rebukes to building our actual LDC out here, because it originally originated from our Jacksonville institution from there, and it was moved here to Lincoln as strictly a completely experimental center, where working with the kids, trying to get their minds developed, getting them to get past other issues and functionings. The institution, as I was saying, it was an experimental school for the instruction and training of, again, as they stated, idiots and feeble-minded. I mean, we try that today. I'm sorry, but we'd be sitting in prison right now for calling him that right now. It would be such a... No, And like I said, I worked in mental health, and if we ever tried doing that, we'd be behind bars right now with such a massive lawsuit, it would not be funny. The LDC was the first facility established in the state of Illinois. The original establishment was in Jacksonville, legislation in 1865. As an experimental school, as I had stated. The institution, when it moved from Jacksonville, was 1877, which was the actual, as I stated before, was the actual completion of the main building in 1877, where they started bringing the kids in there, and as it was stated, capacity of 300. The school itself was originally for children of the ages 7 to 14 years of age, which, going back through and reading through it, I mean, I never realized that we had kids that was there that was that young even to begin with. For my original thought, it was young adults on up. I never thought about coming back to, 7 to 14-year-old children that were the first ones out here at LDC, which actually kind of surprised me. And of course, they were classified as idiotic and deficient in intelligence. The goals of the institution were to improve the children's health, physical health, bathing, and the use of appropriate meds. If kids are brought up at home, we're already looking at that right now. We're talking health, welfare, well-being. We're going to teach them, yes, you have to take a bath, you have to clean up after yourselves, you have to do this. If they're on a medication, this is why you have to be on it. Most of these kids didn't have an idea why, or didn't have a clue why. They were just given these meds. Oh, this is going to help you. Let's go from here. Now we got your clothes. Here we go. Later, as many may have known, in September of 1887, 400 acres at 1 mile south of the facility was leased. The colony of boys lived at the farm and were overseen by a husband and a wife who owned the farm. On October, the 400 acres, 200 were used for farming and crops, and the other 200 were used for pasture and raising of livestock. In 1887, all the beef itself for the facility was actually grown right there at the farm, and with all of the gardening and the farming and things like that, LDC actually almost become completely self-sufficient with raising their own meals, food, having them prepped right there. And this provided improvement of food quality. Eventually the farm was expanded to nearly 500 acres. 50 acres were adjoining the farm, 40 acres of meadowland, which I didn't realize either, but was at Broadwell Township. It had expanded up that far to where it was into Broadwell Township on parts of the 40 acres. An actual farmer, was hired to oversee the institutions, and the farm originally began with just 30 boys who were working at the farm. And all produce coming from the farm was consumed by the institution. Eventually growing of, and why, but we get it. Eventually the growing of wheat and corn ended due to being unprofitable. If you think about it, it's used right there. If it's not being sold, utilize it elsewhere. Still be. And after doing so, it was considered to be more practical. Of course now, the fruits, the vegetables, and things like that strictly for the institution's consumption. At one time, LDC was basically a city, and with the farm was basically a city within its own city. It provided everything that they needed right there on grounds, you know, besides the farm not being actually on the grounds itself. Out at the farm itself, when they started putting in all the extra buildings that we see parts of now that are there at Lincoln, at the Lincoln and Logan Corrections, part of them are still some of the same buildings, some of the locations of them. And eventually that's when the state also built and purchased 725 acres, then built 2 ward buildings that individuals who worked the farm could stay there instead of having to go from the farm back to the LDC, back to the farm. They lived there on a full-time basis. The farm county housed the 620 men, which later became, of course, like I stated, the Lincoln Logan prisons. Unfortunately, they went away. And later on, after World War, well, I should say after the Depression, or during the Great Depression, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a bill that was classified as the New Deal in funding, the state used $30 million to make improvements at the mental hospital here in town, and the actual state school where they were, of course, as they mentioned, you know, feeble-minded. The funding supplied the institution with boilers for heat, power, sewage disposal, heavy equipment for the reconstruction and refurbishing of the old buildings, which greatly relieved the overcrowding and conditions. The new housing space brought to capacity to over 1,000 beds to 4,800 beds at the LDC. And I mean, parts of this where they actually wound up separating our men and women actually shows on here on the 2 bottom photos here what the actual men and the boys and women, or what the buildings themselves actually looked like on that completion afterwards. During the time frame beginning in 1917, numerous improvements were underway. One in particular, which I was asked to go through as much as possible, was the tunnels from the powerhouse. At the powerhouse, which is still standing, that we can see yet today, that is exactly where the tunnels began that go all under Lincoln Developmental Center. When they got the refurbishing money to go to steam power, that's when the tunnels were made and created with the help of the residents, running the new steam lines for heat into the buildings, running all the power lines to continue and build up new bases for power in the buildings. And from the powerhouse, they branched off to all the buildings that was at the facility, where some of them actually crisscrossed, where you can interconnect buildings and go from location to location underneath. But the one that she was really asking me about, a very prominent tunnel that probably a lot of folks, especially younger generations, do not know about. But from the old hospital and the infirmary and morgue, it goes from the grounds clear out to the cemetery behind the Lincoln Logan prisons. And if you're going on Old 66 towards 55 and you happen to look off to your left when you go over Salt Creek, you can still just barely see small sections on both sides of the embankment where that tunnel used to go to. That's the tunnel itself went out to the farm and then out to the cemetery. That way they weren't displaying someone from the facility being brought out to being laid to rest. They just went through the tunnel itself to get them there. Which, for us, the lady that our dad was seeing, was their daughter or son, her daughter used to be at the LDC and was laid to rest out there. And if anyone knows of anyone who has a family member that's out there, the process is something else to get out to the cemetery. I mean, you have to call ahead first to the prison, say, hey, I'm so-and-so, this is who I have laid to rest out here, this is when I'd like to come out and do this. You have to go out to the prison to prove your ID, prove who it is that you're seeing, and then once you get all the approval and they say, oh yeah, we can send you out, you have a guard that goes out with you and escorts you out and then escorts you back. That way there's no issues there at the prison anywhere else. And one thing I forgot to mention on the one tunnel that went from the ODC out to the prison where the cemetery is, it has been blocked off completely. That way there's no issues for escape bases. But yes, it has been completely blocked off. So, and I don't know how many of them that would be out there wouldn't even know about it to begin with. So, but yeah, that was part of our reconstructions with building the tunnels and 30 million going out through the different facilities throughout the state to redo all this. During the time frame beginning in 17, I think I started this. One in particular, like I said, was the tunnels. Portions of building these tunnels, like I said, was actually the residents themselves, besides those who come in on contractor basis, but they used some of those that were had more of a mindful basis, had a stronger mind, that comprehended more. They were the ones who helped build those tunnels under LDC. Between years 45 and 55, during this time, the Illinois Department of Public Welfare received 10 million of 216 million for renovations at the facility. During the following years, many medical improvements were made. They had a pharmacy that was in there. They had an x-ray machine that was brought in there. Improvements to the surgical units and wards that was brought in. Dental facilities that was added for health of the residents and the patients. Plus the hiring of many professionals. Of course, there were more doctors, dentists, other professionals for health care, and so on to give these residents a better living and better life. And some of the others were your counselors, your social workers, your psychologists, and your psychiatrists. Not only the counselors and social workers basically dealt also, besides mental health, but also developmental disabilities, where your psychiatrist and your psychologist were mainly for your mental health. And on that aspect, when it comes down to those, I'm sorry to say, with working at one of our facilities, at one point in time we had 3 different veterans who came in. The very first veteran that we had come in, our counselors, our social workers, our psychologists, psychiatrists, all they had ever known was the basic person off the street. They didn't understand those who were military and the issues that come up with, now as we know, the PTSD and the issues that develop it and react to it. And it literally took 3 of us veterans confronting all 4 of those, like I said, the counselor, social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist. We got told, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not educated for this. When we finally got it through their head, yeah, we are, because we are vets. We know what we're talking about. And when they finally did, recovery basis and the change on things, within 2 to 2.5 weeks, those veterans were being discharged with a completely different program that was set strictly to veterans. It wasn't set to just strictly civilians that really didn't have that form of PTSD that veterans do. And I'm sure we have veterans who are in here right now that have felt the effects of being in the service, whether confined basis or small base or something like that, or actually going through combat or serving with those who did. I'm sure there are those who are here. And I'm sure that they've heard many other time frames as far as that goes when it concerns mental health. That's probably one of my biggest pet peeves when I worked in mental health itself, is them not knowing the basis and ignoring veterans. It really was one of my biggest pet peeves. Now, as I stated before, we all know the cemetery is now located out behind the Lincoln Logan prisons. To finish this evening, as far as things like that go, when I worked in mental health, it showed down in Southern Illinois with some of the differences of what they did then to what we do now. Then they used electric shock therapy with paddles to the side of the head and to the brain. They made the attempts on lobotomies to make the improvements to it, making it work. And I've seen them, not, thank goodness they're not used, but they called them the crib. A small one was set up for small kids and children. Wooden cribs, get them put into it, bring the top down, lock it into place until they quit biting and carrying on. Same thing with adults. They had a larger crib for it to do the same thing.